Good day, everyone, and welcome to another poetry recording. Thank you for joining English with Joshua. The title of this poem is This Winter Coming by Corin Press. This is poem number 7 on the grade 12 prescribed poetry list for English home language. Before we can begin with the poem, we always need to look into the author to get a brief understanding of what their background is. Who is Corin Press? Corin Press was born in Cape Town in 1956. She grew up in the height of apartheid. She is a full-time writer and editor. Her focus is on the empowerment of people through education and writing. Her poems highlight, especially this one, the unequal society created by apartheid. As we look at the background of the poem, this poem was published in 1986, a tumultuous time in South Africa under the apartheid regime. In 1986, this is the year in which the political leaders imposed a nationwide state of emergency to stop the 10th anniversary of the Soweto uprisings of 1976. State of emergency, the police arrested people without any charge. A state of emergency is when a government introduces special measures such as an increased power for the police or army. It usually is because of a civil disorder or because of a national disaster. In this case, during apartheid, it was because of a civil disorder. People caught in this storm were men, women, children, and those who died in the struggle for change. There was widespread violence in the country. This poem on its surface level seems to be about the people's fear about the impending winter. However, upon closer inspection, it is clear that the poem is an extended metaphor for the current and coming violence in the country. This extended metaphor is where winter storms describes how the political situation in South Africa in 1986 is a storm developing. This storm is wanting to wash away the apartheid system. There is also apprehension around the government's renewed state of emergency. As we look at the summary of the poem, the speaker in this poem is concerned about the world she occupies and believes that she is justified to feel fear for how matters will evolve. She states that we have only just entered, implying that worse times are to come. The descriptions of the churning, broken, and sinking sky further highlight her fear and nature's hostility. The misery of the people is made clear in stanza 3. People are hungry and suffering. The distinction between the haves and the have-nots is clear. For example, in the lines, Madam's house is clean, while men are standing on the street corners, jobless and hungry. We also see another example in the bright cars full of sated faces. They drive past the people most affected by the poverty and the hunger. We read the poem. This winter coming. Walking in the thick rain of this winter we have only just entered. Who is not frightened? The sea is swollen, churning in broken waves. Around the rocks the sand is sinking away. The seagulls will not land under the sky, the shroud falling. Who is not frightened? In every part of the city, sad women climbing buses, dogs barking in the street, and the children in every doorway crying. The world is so hungry. Madam's house is clean, and the women return with slow steps to their children. The street, the sky is tolling like a bell. These women are a tide of sadness. They will drown the world. Who is not frightened? On every corner, men standing, old stumps in the rain, tombstones engraved with open eyes, watching the bright cars full of sated faces, more than satisfied. Past them, past them, past them. Who is not frightened? Into the rain the children are running, thin as the barest twigs. They kindle a fire to fight the winter. They are bare bodies, a raging fire of dead children, and the sky collapsing under centuries of rain. The wind like a mountain crying. Who is not frightened of this winter coming upon us now? As we look at the form or structure of the poem, this is a protest poem. It lacks capital letters. It has minimal punctuation, and this we call enjambment. Enjambment is used to mimic how our thoughts run in each other. This is a figure of speech. This is known as a stream of consciousness writing to illustrate the way the speaker is thinking. What matters is getting the message across and not how it is done. We see that there is no rhyme scheme as well, but there is also a rhetorical question at the end of each stanza, which forces the reader to interact with the content of the poem. This poem consists of 5 stanzas of different lengths. Each stanza deals with a different aspect of the situation. Each section is linked by a refrain. A refrain is a line, a phrase, or a single word that is repeated periodically within the poem to build up drama, emphasis, or rhythm. The refrain in this poem is "Who is not frightened?" This repetition or anaphora highlights the point that everyone fears what might happen. So we look at the title of the poem, This Winter Coming. This indicates that it is not a general winter approaching, but rather a specific one. It could either be the literal sense, how cold Cape Town is, or in the figurative sense, it could be South Africa being in winter during this time of the state of emergency. It also suggests that something is going to happen soon. At the time that the poem was written, South Africa was on the brink of a civil war, and this could be winter in a figurative sense. So literally, it is the cold winter. However, figuratively, it could be the impending state of emergency or the social change and the restrictions that this state of emergency would bring. The poem sees it as a time of hardship and death. This social change, which we refer to as winter, also suggests that death of an old order, which is apartheid, this social change cannot be stopped. It creates a foreboding tone. The ing is in continuous tense. This action will continue or it has already started. Walking in the thick rain. Thick here emphasizes the heaviness of the rain. It also is suggestive of an oppressive atmosphere. There's no protection against the elements. Thick rain. The winter rain is quite heavy, so it creates a mood of foreboding or gloom. When it's thick, it's suggestive of an oppressive atmosphere, and this fear is brought by the fact that winter brings thick rain. This indicates the harsh times ahead that will come with the state of emergency. Of this winter, we have only just entered. It's specific of the winter approaching, not the winter in general. We see by the word this. It also speaks of a figurative winter, that being the apartheid government's renewed state of emergency, in which the government's police or army would have more power over the people. We have only just entered creates an ominous tone. It also suggests that the experience of fear will increase as the season progresses. Things will only get worse. This alludes to the possible violence or an uprising against the oppression. Who is not frightened? This rhetorical question suggests a universality to the experience of fear. All South Africans are feeling it. Everybody should be afraid because of the violence that will occur in response to the oppression that's coming from the apartheid government. As we look at line 4 and 5, the sea is swollen, churning in broken waves. Now, at face value, the lines could be read as an observation of the natural environment. However, the imagery and the diction suggest the atmosphere is one of aggression and destructiveness. Note the poet's description of the sea. She uses the words swollen, churning, and broken waves to describe a very turbulent and destructive ocean. This also emphasizes how dangerous the sea is. It is a metaphor comparing the looming violence to a very destructive sea. This could possibly occur in South Africa. The idea that it could be a violent, continual motion suggests that once the violence begins, it will continue until it has met its course. The storm is likened to all those who stand up and fight against apartheid. In line 5, the rocks, the sand is sinking away. The rocks could be a reference to South Africa. It is being held up by the sand, which is sinking or disappearing, in which one's sense of security and stability is eroding. Therefore, the reason here can be to be afraid. When violence begins, South Africa will lose its stability. There is no reason for South Africa to be afraid. In line 6, the seagulls will not land under the sky. Under the sky is described as this shroud falling. A shroud is a cloth for dead bodies. It's used in preparation for a funeral. This here in line 6 we see as a metaphor. The dark sky is going to cover or conceal or fall over South Africa. The rain or resistance paired with the cold from the winter or the government state of emergency is possibly going to be fatal to those particularly who are not protected from it. In line 8, who is not frightened? Again, the rhetorical question or the anaphora heightens the mood of the poem. It emphasizes the fear caused by the impending violence against the people. Who is not frightened of the social and political hardship of South Africa? Literally, this question could also be indicative of those who are going to fall ill or possibly die from being exposed to the elements. However, figuratively, it is making reference to the political and the social hardships in South Africa that is being compared to winter. But the speaker moves from an observation of nature being turbulent, the ocean and the sea being very turbulent, to an analysis of the social structures of the city. Line 9. In every part of the city, sad women climbing buses. These lines give off imagery, very clear imagery of domestic workers traveling to the city from the townships to clean white people's houses. These women are described as sad, and as they leave their homes with dogs barking in the streets, unsheltered from the impending war, they also have to leave their children crying in the doorways to their homes to go and make a living. In every doorway crying, the world is hungry. The world here is a hyperbole. Literally, it could mean suffering from poverty or not having enough food. However, figuratively, they are starved of their human rights. So as we see here, that Madam's house is clean. They are working for pittance or a very small amount of money whilst neglecting their own homes. Please also note that the word madam was used during apartheid as a term of superiority used to address white women. It's ironic here because while the white woman's house is clean and her children are tended to, but black homes are left uncared for and children crying in their doorways. They return to their children with slow steps, struggling from the exhaustion and the defeat. We also note here that stanza 3, the natural elements, we have passed them. However, we speak here about the women and the children in the urban areas being compared to the women and the children of the townships. And the women return with slow steps, exhausted, defeated, into their children. The street, the sky is tolling like a black bell. Upon their return, the sky is tolling like a black bell. This is a simile. The sky is being compared to a black bell. The sky is dark and ringing like a bell that announces death. It gives off a very foreboding and ominous mood. These women are a tide of sadness that will drown the world. Tide of sadness, the women are described as having a tide of sadness. This is a metaphor. The extent of their sadness is so great it is compared to a sea. Their sadness is so intense that they will drown the world. They will drown the world continues the extended metaphor of a sea that is swollen and dangerous. The danger comes not from anger but from sadness. The uprising does not come from anger. Even though these women seem helpless to making change to their situation, the words suggest otherwise. Their sadness can cause death and destruction. Who is not frightened? The anaphora or rhetorical question shows up again, emphasizing that all South Africans should feel fear. Stanza 4 continues to highlight the social divide in which the lives of the privileged are contrasted with the poverty and the hunger of the masses. On every corner, men standing. The men now are described as standing on every corner. Picture men that are unemployed, waiting for someone to offer them work. Still, no jobs are available. These men are referred to as old stumps in the rain. This is a metaphor where men are being compared to tree stumps that were once succeeding and thriving. However, they have been cut down by the apartheid regime, and now they are almost dead. These men are also compared to tombstones with open eyes. In this metaphor, these men are compared to cold, hard tombstones. Their opened eyes are the only signs of them being alive. To see, but they do not feel anything. So they are basically zombie-like. Watching the cars, bright cars full of sated faces, more than satisfied. While these men wait for someone to offer them work as they stand around, they are watching the bright cars passing them by. The occupants of these cars are described as having sated faces that were more than satisfied. The word sated means having an appetite that is more than satisfied. So we see that these men in the bright cars are very rich and having fancy cars, having everything that they want. It's a clear contrast between the haves and the have-nots. The privileged people who in these cars are not only sheltered and well-fed, they're almost overfed from the storm. This idea contrasts with the idea of line 12 of this poem, in which the world is so hungry. These men watch these cars belonging to the privileged, pass them, pass them, pass them. The repetition of these words emphasizes how the cars don't ever stop, and how, for some of the privileged few, the poor masses are simply invisible. Some might pass them out of fear or out of guilt, or out of refusal to confront the reality of the inequality. Who is not frightened? This anaphora or repetition of the rhetorical question, who is not frightened, is a reminder to the reader that something has to change in this society. Stanza 4 focused on the men. The men are meant to be providers of their family, but they are presented as ghosts of their former selves, as they cannot find any work. Into the rain the children are running. In the literal sense, the children could be just playing in the rain. However, in the figurative sense, this line could be interpreted in two ways. Firstly, it could refer to how the response of the children differs from the adults who are fearful of the storm or the political unrest. Also look at it as children being innocent and not aware of the fact that they are also victims of apartheid. The second way of interpreting this line would be that this is a reference to the children who ran through the storm knowingly. Remember that the poem was written in the year of the 10th anniversary of the Soweto uprising. These protests were led by the black school children of June 16. They ran through a storm of their own creation. Children here are also described as being thin as the barest twigs. This is a simile comparing how skinny these children are to twigs, emphasizing their poverty-stricken situation. These children kindle a fire to fight the winter. In the literal sense, they light a fire to keep warm during the cold winter. However, figuratively, the fire represents the fight the youth will start against the apartheid system and the state of emergency represented by the idea of winter. The children are described as having bare bodies. Literally, this would refer to the children in poor conditions who might lack clothing. They could also be seen as vulnerable. Line 27, a raging fire of dead children. This could refer to the children who died during the violent uprisings like the Sharpeville massacre and the Soweto uprisings. We see that this focuses on the children. They're not scared of the rain, and they are confronting it in this stanza. They are also going to defeat this apartheid regime. In line 27, the word raging suggests the passion of the children and the maliciousness of the apartheid system. Line 28, and the sky collapsing under centuries of rain. The sky is collapsing. The dark sky can be a symbol of oppression, and it is now collapsing. This gives a sense that the apartheid system will come to an end soon. The sky is collapsing under centuries. We see the time for change has officially arrived. The state of emergency might get worse before it gets better, but there will be a change. Centuries of rain is normally a positive connotation, but here rain has a negative connotation. It represents oppression, emphasizing the pain and the suffering that they had to endure for such a long time. The wind like a mountain crying. This could possibly suggest that the rain, suffering, sadness, and rage, like a wind, will bring a mountain to tears as a violent storm approaches. Note how the poem ends on another rhetorical question. Who is not frightened of this winter coming upon us now? This winter is about to arrive, imminent on everyone. Everyone's going to experience it, even the privileged people. The state of emergency means a frightening time for all South Africans. The purpose of this anaphora is to conclude with a strong warning of what seems to lie ahead, or it is also to show that they do not need to be afraid, because the children of the future will fight for everyone. As we look at the mood of the poem, remember that the mood is how the reader feels after reading the text. Here the mood is anxious, it is also restless and frightened. When we look at the themes here are the effects of apartheid, the desire for change, suffering and oppression, resistance and hope. As we look at the tone of the poem, please remember that the tone is how the poet brings the message across, how it sounds from the poet's perspective. It sounded quite somber, and the poem sounded solemn. So we look at past questions that have come up in the exams. It's important to note that each section usually consists of 4 questions, 2 mark and a 3 mark. We need to make sure that we look at the mark allocation in order to be able to formulate our responses correctly. But we also need to look at the action verbs used and what you're expected to respond to in the poem. The first question here is, how does the use of the word sad in line 9 contribute to a melancholic tone of the poem? 3.2. Refer to the line, explain the image, the sky tolling like a black bell. 3.3. Refer to line 9 to 21. Old stumps in the rain, tombstones, engraved with open eyes, watching the bright cars full of sated faces. Discuss how the contrast in these lines connects to the message of the poem as a whole. The last question, refer to lines 27 to 30. A raging fire upon us now. Critically discuss how the images in line 27 to 29, a raging fire like a mountain crying, explains the poet's rhetorical question on line 30. Once you've looked at your questions, these were the responses that were given in the marking guideline. You can pause to go through them. It's important to note that each response needs to follow the mark allocation. If it is a 2-mark question, try your best to have 2 sentences, while if it's a 3-mark one, aim for 3 to maximize on the word or the mark. A few tips from the 2023 marking comments. Technical aspects such as diction, phrases, imagery, repetition, and the effects they have on a poem must be understood. If you're still not sure about them, please find them in my first video titled The Introduction to Poetry. Second tip, all parts of the question must be answered. For example, for a question that asks how a particular word influences the reader's response to an aspect or subject, candidates must explain how they were made to feel about the subject. Point number 3, use synonyms for diction referred to in the poem. Please don't spend your time just simply lifting words from the poem. It doesn't show any understanding from the candidate's side, and you will not be awarded any marks for that. Your last point, when a question has a critically component to it, for example, critically discuss, critically explain, the learner must be able to look very closely at the meaning of what needs to be looked at, and thereafter make an evaluation or an assessment on the aspect under scrutiny. This is where the candidate's insight or prior knowledge is required to adequately answer the question. So you need to understand your questions to respond correctly, but you also need to have a lot of background knowledge, and that's why we look into the poet, we look into the context. These things would assist you to then answer your critically discuss or critically component question to the best of your ability. These are the credits of the resources that I used to compile the presentation. Thank you so much for watching. Now, I wish you all the best. I hope you've learned something today. As we move to stanza 3,